Hey everybody, just back again for the sixth video in this series on the truth about psychiatry. Last time we talked about Thomas Szasz and his groundbreaking book, the Myth of Mental Illness. I'd like to follow up with some more quotations from that book, and then I'm really excited to introduce one of the best modern writers, critics of psychiatry, a woman named Bonnie Burstow. I also hope to touch briefly on the book, Gary Greenberg's The Book of Woe, on the DSM V. And hopefully, while I'm reviewing these authors, be able to explain a little bit more what psychiatry is, what the truth about psychiatry is, and also what anti-psychiatry is and what it isn't. So to begin, I'm just going to delve back into Szasz and his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, just to share a few brief passages before we get to Bonnie Burstow. In the introduction to his book, The Myth of Mental Illness, Szasz says, "Psychiatry is conventionally defined as a medical specialty concerned with the diagnosis and treatment of mental diseases. I submit that this definition, which is still widely accepted, places psychiatry in the company of alchemy and astrology and commits it to the category of pseudoscience. The reason for this is that there is no such thing as quote-unquote mental illness. Psychiatrists must now choose between continuing to define their discipline in terms of non-existent entities or substantives, or redefining it in terms of the actual interventions or processes in which they engage." So obviously, Szasz received a lot of criticism for these kinds of remarks, and there were many attempts not just to respond to Szasz, but to dismiss him, to just calumny and leveling of false accusations against him for what I see as just simply telling the truth. And I'd like to share a little bit also from the preface of his book to begin to outline a little bit more about what psychiatry is and why there is such a thing as a psychiatric survivors movement and why there's such a thing as anti-psychiatry. So maybe before I read this passage from Szasz's preface, I'll just say that etymologically, the word psychiatry comes from the Greek psyche, meaning soul, and iatros, meaning medical treatment. So, however psychiatry developed, the word psychiatry is supposed to define the activity of the profession, or the so-called profession. But if you think about it, just pause to think about the word for a minute. Psyche means soul, iatros means medical treatment. Now, that would imply that a psychiatrist, first of all, it implied that a psychiatrist knows what a soul is. And secondly, it would imply that there is such a thing as medical treatment that can be applied to the soul. If that's not enough from the outset to give someone a sense of skepticism regarding the so-called profession of psychiatry, maybe just follow along with these videos and you'll have more reasons to wonder whether such a thing is possible. This is not to say that the soul or the spirit, that people can't suffer in spiritual or emotional ways, and that there isn't such a thing as spiritual and emotional healing. There is, but I would submit to you that that healing comes in a way that is not provided by the pseudoscientific enterprise known as psychiatry. So Szasz, in his preface, uh, he recounts kind of the reaction that he received to do his essay on the myth of mental illness. And he says, in 1967, my efforts to undermine the moral legitimacy of the alliance of psychiatry and the state suffered a serious blow: the creation of the antipsychiatry movement by David Cooper and Ronald Lang. Instead of advocating the abolition of institutional psychiatry, they sought to replace it with their own brand of psychiatry, which they called anti-psychiatry. By means of this dramatic misnomer, they attracted attention to themselves and deflected attention from what they did, which included coercions and excuses based on psychiatric authority and power. Antipsychiatry is a type of psychiatry. The psychiatrist qua healthcare professional is a fraud, and so too is the antipsychiatrist. So this was Szasz, early in the 60s, this was Szasz responding to a movement created by Cooper and Lang that called itself antipsychiatry, but it was a misnomer because Lang and Cooper weren't exactly opposing psychiatry. They were trying to replace it with another form of psychiatry. So that's why Szasz tried to distance himself and disassociate himself from that antipsychiatry movement. And that antipsychiatry movement needs to be distinguished from the one that Szasz initiated, and the one that Bonnie Burstow has also been influential in promoting. Even though Szasz was critical of the term antipsychiatry, I think that he would side with a lot of present antipsychiatrists and critics of psychiatry, or even abolitionists, people who call for the abolition of psychiatry. Szasz continues, Voltaire's famous aphorism, "God protect me from my friends, I'll take care of my enemies," proved to apply perfectly to what happened next. Although my critique of the alliance of psychiatry and the state antedates by 2 decades the reinvention and popularization of the term antipsychiatry, I was smeared as an antipsychiatrist, and my critics wasted no time identifying and dismissing me as a leading antipsychiatrist. For more than 50 years, I have maintained that mental illnesses are counterfeit diseases, non-diseases, that coerced psychiatric relations are like coerced labor relations, slavery, or coerced sexual relations, rape. And I spent the better part of my professional life criticizing the concept of mental illness, objecting to the practices of involuntary institutional psychiatry, and advocating the abolition of psychiatric slavery and psychiatric rape. Notice the word abolition. Szasz was an abolitionist. He wanted to abolish psychiatric slavery and psychiatric rape. And he has several books written, even by that title, Psychiatric Slavery, Coercion as Cure, Liberation by Oppression, several books where he explicitly compares psychiatry to slavery. And that's an apt comparison. Not surprisingly, and I'm quoting Szasz again, not surprisingly, the more aggressively I reminded psychiatrists that individuals incarcerated in mental hospitals are deprived of liberty, the more zealously they insisted that mental illnesses are like other illnesses, and that psychiatric institutions are bona fide medical hospitals. The psychiatric establishment's defense of coercions and excuses thus reinforced my argument about the metaphorical nature of mental illness, and the importance of the distinction between coerced and consensual psychiatry. So this last part about coerced psychiatry versus consensual psychiatry is a point where I disagree with Szasz. Szasz was a psychiatrist, and he did have clients and did his brand of psychotherapy, even though he also wrote a book called The Myth of Psychotherapy, which is also a great book. But I would disagree with Szasz about making a distinction between coercive and consensual psychiatry, because in reality, all of psychiatry is coercive. It is coercive by nature. It is inherently coercive. That's how it was founded, created. And like Whitaker says, it's the rotten barrel. even though there's good apples in that rotten barrel. Um, Szasz continues, anyone who seeks to help others, whether by means of religion or by means of medicine, must eschew the use of force. I like that. I'm not aware of any antipsychiatrist who has agreed with this principle or abided by this limitation. So he's talking about the old antipsychiatrists, the Cooper, Lang, and those people. Subsuming my work under the rubric of antipsychiatry betrays and negates it just as effectively and surely as subsuming it under the rubric of psychiatry. My writings form no part of either psychiatry or antipsychiatry, and belong to neither. They belong to conceptual analysis, social political criticism, civil liberties, and common sense. This is why I rejected and continue to reject psychiatry and antipsychiatry with equal vigor. So again, Szasz has another book called Antipsychiatry Quackery Squared, where he criticizes Lang and Cooper and others of this early antipsychiatry movement. But I just want to make sure to distinguish this form of antipsychiatry that Szasz criticized with the current antipsychiatry movement, which has more to do with what Szasz had in mind, namely not just criticizing psychiatry, but abolishing it. And Burstow writes extensively on antipsychiatry, the abolition of psychiatry, and what that means and how it should be done. So let me just see if there's any other passages here in The Myth of Mental Illness that are worthy of note. I mean, the whole book is worth reading, especially the first part, but let's see. You know, he talks about the invention of mental illness, you know, different ways of perceiving disease or defining disease. So yeah, on page 34, Szasz writes, throughout this book, I regard bodily diseases as real or literal and consider mental diseases as counterfeit or metaphorical illnesses. I like his use of the word counterfeit because so much in psychiatry is counterfeit. Counterfeit healing, counterfeit doctors, counterfeit medicine, counterfeit drug, well, not counterfeit drug, counterfeit medicines. They're actual, you know, harmful psychotropic drugs, harmful chemical substances that are presented as a medical remedy. So there's a lot, and Szasz does a great job of revealing what the counterfeits of psychiatry. Ultimately, I would even say that the counterfeit comes down to, Szasz wouldn't agree with me because he was an atheist, but I believe there's a God, and I believe that he sent his son, Jesus Christ, as the great physician and the master healer. And he knows how to heal anything, whether it be spiritual, emotional, physical. He understands it all. And he's the great physician, the great healer. And I think what psychiatry does is an attempt to counterfeit that. And there's so many ways in which it is a counterfeit that perhaps we'll talk about that more in future discussions. Szasz talks more about Freud, revealing that he was a fraud, and Charcot, that he was also a fraud. So let's see. He even quotes Mortimer Adler. Like, this guy, he just read, and he knew who he read a lot of books. He was very well read and understood literature and history and science and all sorts of things. Very, very interesting fellow. Here's a passage shortly after mentioning Mortimer Adler on page 39. Szasz says, the role of the psychiatrist as expert arbiter charged with deciding who is or is not ill has not ceased with the renaming of malingering as hysteria and with calling the latter an illness. It has merely made his job more arbitrary and nonsensical. And Mortimer Adler had noted long ago that psychoanalysts are trying to swallow everything in psychoanalysis. So Mortimer Adler was critical of psychiatry, and Szasz knew that. There's another author that Szasz read thoroughly, who was one of the early critics of psychiatry, a guy named Karl Kraus, I believe in Austria, Germany or Austria, and he was a contemporary of Freud and these guys, and he knew from the outset that psychiatry and the brand of psychology that Freud and his cohorts were developing, this guy Karl Kraus saw through it from the very beginning. And Szasz has read Karl Kraus and commented. He has a book. Szasz has a book on Karl Kraus called, what is that called? It's called Anti-Freud, and it's on Karl Kraus. It's an excellent, one of Szasz's best books in my opinion. So a few more passages here, and we'll get into Bonnie Burstow. This use of the medical model, namely the idea that psychiatric treatment must be based on psychiatric diagnosis, has, in my opinion, led to a disastrous abuse of patients. There's so much that we can talk about the psychiatric abuse of patients, and there's many books written about that, and Burstow has more to say about that. Maybe one or two more. Oh yeah, there's something at the end. So maybe one or two more passages. On page 77, Szasz says, in my opinion, this sort of search for the biological and physical causes of so-called psychopathological phenomena is motivated more by the investigator's craving for prestige and power than by his desire for understanding and clarity. I have suggested earlier that patterning his beliefs and behavior on the medical model enables the psychiatrist to share in the prestige and power of the physician. The same applies to the psychiatric and psychological investigator or research worker. Because theoretical physicists enjoy greater prestige than theoreticians of psychology or human relations, psychiatrists and psychoanalysts stand to gain from claiming, as they do, that at bottom, as it were, they too are in quest of the physical or physiological causes of bodily illnesses. This impersonation makes them, of course, pseudophysicists and pseudophysicians, and has many regrettable consequences. Yet this imitation of the natural scientist has been largely successful, at least in a social or opportunistic way. I refer to the widespread social acceptance of psychiatry and psychoanalysis as an allegedly biological and hence ultimately psychochemical sciences, and to the prestige of their practitioners based in part on this connection between what they claim to do and what other scientists do. This is an accurate point in my estimation, that psychiatry developed as a way of by way of the attempt to legitimize the illegitimate work of the pseudoscientific field of psychiatry. So in other words, what Szasz is saying, if I am understanding him correctly, that physicians automatically, in our society, and even when psychiatry was, the early days of psychiatry, of modern psychiatry, physicians enjoyed a certain amount of prestige, power and prestige. And in order to tap into that, psychiatrists saw that they had to somehow legitimize what many perceived to be just quackery. And the attempt to legitimize this as part of the reason behind the ongoing quest for a biological or physical, as Szasz puts it, biological and physical causes of so-called psychopathological phenomena. in other words, the hunt for the chemical imbalance or the hunt for the mysterious biological marker for mental illnesses that has been going on since the beginning of psychiatry and will go on forever, because they will never find it. I like to say that the hunt for the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus, and although Santa Claus is based on, you know, a real person who lived. Anyway, that's another story. We can talk about Santa Claus another time. But the hunt for the Easter Bunny or a leprechaun, I think we will stumble upon a leprechaun before anyone stumbles upon the physical or biological marker of mental illness. And that's because there is no such thing as mental illness, and also because even if there were, there's never been and never will be a biological marker for such a thing. Because, as Szasz points out, once there's any sort of biological marker, let's say a lesion or a tumor or some other injury, that immediately puts the diagnosis squarely in the field of medicine, where it's an actual diagnosis, measurable, observable physical reality, as opposed to the invented and, in many cases, fantastical idea of an illness in the mind, which, as Szasz often points out, is more often someone's observance of a behavior that they find questionable or of which they disapprove. Almost done with Szasz here or at least with this book, The Myth of Mental Illness, for today. Maybe a little bit more on the reception of this book. Szasz writes in the appendix, during the 1950s, I published a score of articles in professional journals challenging the epistemological foundations of the concept of the mental illness and refuting the legal moral legitimacy of involuntary mental hospitalization and the insanity defense. In 1958, as my book, The Myth of Mental Illness, was nearing completion, I wrote a short paper with the same title. Oh, so he wrote the paper while he was writing the book, which I submitted to every major American psychiatric journal, none of which accepted it for publication. So here's a psychiatrist, one of the best in the field, writing a paper that is rejected by every psychiatric journal. So that ought to tell you something about how true it was. As fate would have it, and because the competition between psychologists and psychiatrists for a slice of the mental health pie was then even more intense than it is now, the American Psychologist published the essay in 1960. The following year, the book appeared. I think it is fair to say that psychiatry has not been the same since. Responses to my work have varied from lavish praise to bitter denunciation. American psychiatrists quickly closed ranks against me. Official psychiatry dismissed my contention that misbehaviors are not diseases by asserting that I deny the reality that mental diseases are like other diseases, and it distorted my critique of psychiatric slavery as denying the life-saving treatment to mental patients. The truth is that I sought to deprive psychiatrists of their power to involuntarily hospitalize or treat competent adults called quote-unquote mental patients. My critics chose to interpret this proposal as my trying to deprive competent adults of their right or opportunity to seek or receive psychiatric help. So here's Szasz, who's trying to help, pull down the fake prestige and the unwarranted power of psychiatry for the benefit of those that it abuses, and his critics are, interpreting him as doing the opposite. By 1970, I became a non-person in American psychiatry. The pages of American psychiatric journals were shut to my work. Soon the very mention of my name became anathema and was omitted from new editions of texts that had previously featured my views. In short, I became the object of that most effective of all criticisms, the silent treatment, or as the Germans so aptly call it, Totschweigetaktik, something like that. It's the German for the silent treatment. So that's something that Szasz talks about with Karl Kraus. Karl Kraus also got the silent treatment. Thomas Szasz got the silent treatment. So whenever Szasz wasn't dismissed, he was ignored. Um, Whenever he wasn't criticized, he was also ignored. So there is an entire book that I'm just going to grab really quickly, if I can pull it out here. Oh, shoot. And this is an excellent book. Um, it's called Szasz Under Fire. The Psychiatric Abolitionist Faces His Critics. And it's a book just chock full of essays criticizing Szasz's thesis and criticizing Szasz's body of work. And it comes complete with Szasz's response to each one of his critics. And it's a masterpiece because, in my opinion, Szasz is he's just so spot on, and all of his critic, he just tears his critics apart. So it's a very interesting book. And that should suffice today on Thomas Szasz and the myth of mental illness. And so I'd like to get into our next author, Bonnie Burstow. So reading from the Wikipedia page, Bonnie Burstow, March 6, 1945 to January 4th, 2020. Oh, really? It was that recent. So she just passed away very recently. Bonnie Burstow was a Canadian psychotherapist, author, and antipsychiatry scholar. She was a professor on the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. In 2016, the University of Toronto launched the Bonnie Burstow Scholarship in Antipsychiatry, which is awarded annually to students at the OISE conducting research in antipsychiatry. It is the first antipsychiatry scholarship in the world, and it provoked a controversy regarding academic freedom after it was announced. It was criticized by a mental health activist who noted in the Huffington Post, real reliable source of information, the Huffington Post, that the scholarship had been praised by the Canadian divisions of the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, a nonprofit organization established by the Church of Scientology. So here we have, once again, someone coming along, Bonnie Burstow, telling the truth about psychiatry, and immediately some silly journalists bringing up the specter of Scientology in order to dismiss her legitimate criticisms. The reality is Thomas Szasz was influential in establishing the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, and that connection with Scientology is more tenuous than what anyone who brings it up ever realizes. So whenever you hear someone claim that Szasz or Bonnie Burstow or antipsychiatry is affiliated with Scientology, you can know that that person is wrong and just trying to dismiss the truth about psychiatry. It's been an effective tactic, though, because a lot of people, even though there are a lot of Scientologists who oppose psychiatry, there are obviously a lot of people who oppose Scientology, and for good reason, think it's a nutty thing. Although Tom Cruise is a Scientologist, and he also has some really great things to say about psychiatry. This is not to accept Scientology, but it is to say that through whatever his affiliation, or maybe it wasn't just his affiliation with Scientology, whatever it was, Tom Cruise figured out some things about psychiatry that are actually true. Burstow insists that attempts to connect her to Scientology are, quote, bogus smear tactics, unquote. Exactly. That's what they are. Whenever Scientology is brought up, it's a bogus smear tactic against Szasz. It was against Bonnie Burstow. And if anyone tries it against me, it's bogus because I have nothing to do with Scientology, and I know that Scientology is ridiculous, just like psychiatry is. In 2019, Bonnie Burstow gave $25,000 of her own money to create the Bonnie Burstow Scholarship for research into anti-Semitism. She has written several non-fiction books, including Psychiatry and the Business of Madness, as well as the novels The House on Lippincott and The Other Mrs. Smith. Bonnie Burstow died at the age of 74 on January 4th, 2020, just a few months ago. So The Other Mrs. Smith is her fictional work on electroshock, I believe. And the other books, the book that was mentioned here and others, are some books that I'd like to introduce to you now. So I hope that this is starting to come together from the first video. This is the 6th video already, so putting all the pieces together to understand how we got from, James Davies and Robert Whitaker, and to Thomas Szasz, and now to Bonnie Burstow, and what psychiatry is, what antipsychiatry is, what it is and isn't. These are things that will become increasingly more clear as we continue. So Bonnie Burstow, in addition to her fictional works, has written a book, or collaborated in the writing of a book called Psychiatry Disrupted, Theorizing Resistance and Crafting the Revolution, Psychiatry and the Business of Madness, An Ethical and Epistemological Accounting, and Psychiatry Interrogated, and an Institutional Ethnography Anthology. So these are all great books, but I'd like to start with the one, I think chronologically, Psychiatry Disrupted comes first, and just kind of give you a brief introduction, maybe pull out some good quotes. I have blog posts on all of these books that I've mentioned thus far, so you can find those on the blog, and I'll post a link below. The address is psychiatricsurvivors.wordpress.com. So, Psychiatry Disrupted. Maybe I'll just... I have some notes here. I have my blog post here. So, Psychiatry Disrupted is, I think, even more powerful. Szasz had very powerful critique and powerful language, but Bonnie Burstow, I think, puts it up another level as far as her critique of psychiatry. They were both abolitionists, Szasz and Burstow, and I agree more with Szasz, even though he's too libertarian for my taste. I think he was smarter politically and understood philosophy better than Burstow. Although Burstow is brilliant and an excellent writer, very prolific and also very eloquent. But her gift, I also believe, is she was able to explain things so clearly, very difficult concepts, very clearly, in a way to persuade people who might never have heard of these things before. She just writes so beautifully well. So let's see. Yeah, there is a quote from... Well, let me just read from my blog post for a while, and I'll comment on that, because this is a good introduction to her first book. Bonnie Burstow has written a few very interesting books and a variety of thought-provoking articles. Her book, Psychiatry Interrogated, was dedicated to everyone everywhere who has ever fallen prey to institutional psychiatry, and it initiates the process of dismantling coercive psychiatry. Her book, Psychiatry and the Business of Madness, is even better. In it, she recounts the true history of psychiatry from antiquity to the present day. Oh, this is Psychiatry and the Business of Madness. So, I like both books, but Psychiatry and the Business of Madness is the one I would recommend first of all. So in it, she recounts the true history of psychiatry from antiquity to the present day, and she exposes the nefarious nature of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. Burstow has also written a novel about a victim of electroshock torture entitled The Other Mrs. Smith. In 2014, Burstow published Psychiatry Disrupted, This book goes a step further than any previous book in the antipsychiatry canon. In Psychiatry Disrupted, Burstow and her colleagues do more than criticize psychiatry for the abomination that it is. They theorize about the best ways to resist psychiatric coercion and how to craft a revolution. Although I disagree with much of Burstow's ultra-liberal, extreme feminist rhetoric, she is one of the few people who understands the need to abolish psychiatry. In spite of her utopian political ideologies, she makes many good points about antipsychiatry and the justice of the cause of abolition. She seems to have a sincere respect for psychiatric survivors, and her own life experience has taught her much about the evils of psychiatry. She is more, I believe that one of her relatives, her father or someone, I'll have to look this up, but I believe that one of her relatives was tortured and abused by psychiatrists. She seems to have a sincere respect for, let's see, I read that. She is more familiar with the work of Thomas Szasz than most people, which also makes her a powerful ally in the just cause of antipsychiatry. In short, she understands the truth about psychiatry better than most people, and therefore her books, including this one, are very much worth reading. So in this book, she's trying, in Psychiatry Disrupted, theorizing the resistance and crafting the revolution, she wants to figure out how to end psychiatry. She takes a nonviolent approach to activism, but she is very much a revolutionary. To understand why someone would feel passionately enough about antipsychiatry to wish to craft a revolution, one would either have to be a psychiatric survivor, or else one would have to obtain an accurate understanding of the true history of psychiatry on their own. Although Burstow is not a survivor herself, she understands the true history of psychiatry, and she has relevant experiences that fuel her desire to work toward the abolition of psychiatry. In the third chapter of Psychiatry Disrupted, Burstow presents what she calls the attrition model for antipsychiatry. Her purpose is to unite a community of those who wish to combat psychiatry and to call attention to methods for its elimination. This particular method is based on the model of the prison abolition movement. Burstow is aware that not everyone understands what antipsychiatry is or why psychiatry ought to be abolished. Thus, she patiently explains the reasons and the justice of the cause. So, and here's a good passage to show, how well she writes and also how well she explains this seemingly difficult concept. The goal of antipsychiatry, Burstow explains, is quite simple: nothing less than the abolition or end of the psychiatric system. Herein lies its ultimate distinction. While people critical of psychiatry but not fully anti-psychiatry may take certain kinds of changes as sufficient, the advent of informed consent, less use of drugs, a kind, gentler industry, or diagnostic categories that are less overlapping, for example, as clarified in documents like the Coalition Against Psychiatric Assault fact sheet, anti-psychiatry holds that no changes will be sufficient, for the institution is too flawed and dangerous simply to be tinkered with. So this is something that distinguishes Szasz and Burstow and other abolitionists from people like Whitaker and Breggin, although Whitaker and Breggin are, excellent resources and they write very clearly on the truth about psychiatry. But Burstow, Szasz, and others who are abolitionists take it to a new level because they understand, as I understand, that psychiatry is not it's not something that can be reformed or reworked. There are psychiatric survivors of whom I am aware who like to compare, and it's crass, but they like to compare reformers or critics of psychiatry as their attempt is like polishing a turd. One of them in a blog post, in a comment on a blog post, said that it's like, it's a pile of excrement, the S word. But my response to this was simply, actually no, a pile of manure or a pile of excrement is useful for something. You can fertilize a garden. It has nutritive value for plants. Psychiatry, on the other hand, is is nothing like that. I compared it more to like a black hole that sucks away the light and life of everything. Psychiatry cannot. It's like slavery. It cannot be uh, reformed. I mean, you wouldn't go back to the Third Reich and think of ways to reform Nazism to make it more palatable. You wouldn't go back to chattel slavery in the South and think of better ways to manage the institution of slavery. No, these are evils that need to be abolished. The same is true about psychiatry. And this is how Burstow puts it, if I can find it. Let's see. The goal, let's see, did I just read this? Yeah, I just read that part. Um, yeah, no changes will be sufficient. Um, how might anti-psychiatry activists proceed? The point is that we are up against a very complex system with huge vested interests, with the complicity of the state, and with the blessings of a fearful general public. Those are important points. Complicity of the state, fearful general public. Um, and we are also up against thousands of years of prejudice against people whose ways of thinking and processing differ from those of folk deemed quote unquote normal. Prejudice that predates the medical model and predates psychiatry, but has been made far more formidable by the veneer of science. That's just, and my comment on my blog post is she's absolutely right about this. Bonnie Burstow patiently presents her ideas for resistance and revolution, and she invites collaboration with others who understand the necessity for the abolition of psychiatry. Although I reject her utopianism as untenable, she has a crystal clear understanding of the unfathomable harm that psychiatry causes on a regular basis. Quote, besides that they have the lion's share of the power, people who successfully make this world a living hell for others, who rob others of their freedom, who subject them to torturous treatments, tend to be very good at what they do. We need to be equally good. So my conclusion, I concur. My personal opinion, however, is that there is a better way to accomplish the resistance and the revolution. This is a subject for another blog post, but in brief, I believe that the abolition of psychiatry can only be accomplished with the help of a power greater than our own, namely with the help of Almighty God. If we are attentive to the triumph of truth, virtue, and liberty throughout history, it will become clear that God has had a hand in it all along. The deliverance of the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt, the deliverance of David and the Israelites from Goliath, the deliverance of the early American colonists from the tyranny of Great Britain, the deliverance of the southern slaves from the tyranny of slave owners, the deliverance of the Allied forces from Nazi oppression, and the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement. Each of these moments of deliverance was accomplished with the help of Almighty God. Moses, David, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, and Martin Luther King Jr. each acknowledged his debt to divine providence. The same will be true when the tyranny of psychiatry is overthrown. I simply wish to acknowledge the hand of God in anticipation of this blessed day. So I see this this eventual abolition of psychiatry as maybe certainly different, but there are many parallels with previous moments of deliverance. And unfortunately, there are very few in the anti-psychiatry movement or the psychiatric survivors movement, although there are some who believe in a higher power. Actually, there are probably more than I think, but some of them tend to side more with Bonnie in being, for my taste, much too Marxist and liberal or utopian in their ideologies of how psychiatry will be abolished. Which ultimately, I think that's not how it'll happen. If we just look at history and consider how freedom has been advanced in the past, I think it highly unlikely that any Marxist utopian schemes are going to be what leads to that. So that's Psychiatry Disrupted. It's got a series of essays, one of which is written by Bonnie Burstow, and a couple of which are written by Bonnie Burstow. So her attrition model, basically in sum, her attrition model is that psychiatry, it's kind of maybe like slavery. It took a long time for slavery to be abolished, and it's not like psychiatry will be abolished from one moment to the next. So her argument is that it's going to take time and kind of the gradual withering away of the corrupt institution. So that's her book. The next book is Psychiatry and the Business of Madness. This is such an excellent book. One of the best books ever written on psychiatry, in my opinion. So I highly recommend it. In my blog post, I call it nothing short of a masterpiece. She improves upon Thomas Szasz, Bregan, Whitaker, articulates clearly the problem of psychiatry. Chapter titles are just, scintillating. Let's see. Truth about psychiatry. So, on my blog posts, I just introduce it with gushing praise, except for the last chapter, which, although it does have some interesting stories. So, Bonnie Burstow sort of considered herself to be like a modern Cassandra, and she tells the story of Cassandra, ancient Greek mythology, how she was blessed with the gift of prophecy, but she was cursed that no one would ever believe her. Cassandra predicted the fall of Troy, and of course she was right, but then no one would ever believe her. And so Bonnie identifies with that myth, and I think looking at her work and the work of Thomas Szasz and others who are critical of psychiatry or hope to abolish psychiatry, you can see they kind of do have this Cassandra mentality, and rightfully so, because I think they're right about psychiatry, and from my own experience, I've also noticed that even though these are people telling the truth about psychiatry, and a truth that I want to echo, there seem to be very few who listen or understand, kind of like when Cassandra was, prophesying the fall of Troy, and she basically went mad. I guess I'd have to look up the myth again, but because she was trying to tell people what's going on, but no one would believe her. So I mean, I think it's been true of many people who, even like Ignaz Semmelweis, the person that Szasz admired, here he was telling the truth, and they threw him in a mental hospital because he told the truth. So, and if Cassandra predicted the fall of Troy, there are many people writing today who are looking at our current circumstances in the United States and seeing how that compares with, past civilizations, the rise and fall of ancient Rome, for example, and who suggests that maybe we're not so far from that eventual fall. So all of that is just a preface to this great book, The Psychiatry and the Business of Madness. And it is a business, as we've seen, and it's a very lucrative business. There are so many passages that I want to share from this book, but I would recommend that you read it and find out for yourself what you think. But let me go ahead and just pick out a few passages. Maybe you're getting tired if you've been watching along this time. It looks like this might be one of my longer videos, but you can always pause it and come back later. So, what is the purpose of this book? Bonnie Burstow asks at the beginning, I ask you more fundamentally to be open to questioning the very concept of mental illness on which psychiatry rests. a counterintuitive thing to do, given that mental illness appears to be all around us, in the rambling of the street person, on billboards and hospitals, and as such seems as real as the air we breathe. What is involved here, to be clear, is revisiting what seems to be cut and dry, stepping outside of the circle of certainty that has bit by bit been built up around this institution, and daring to rethink. And this is a good point. Burstow says that the very concept of mental illness is the foundation upon which psychiatry rests. And as we've shown, it's a false concept. So eventually psychiatry will disintegrate because it's based on falsehood. But people like Szasz and Burstow, Whitaker and Bregan, and many others are trying to help that process along a little bit. So that's an introduction. What is the focus of this book? Let's see. Insofar as they facilitate the work of psychiatry, I include here the various apparatuses of the state: courts, mental health laws, ministries which provide funding, mechanisms of enforcement, mechanisms of oversight. I include industries that feed it and which are in turn fed by it, such as the pharmaceutical industry and the medical research industry. I include the army of professionals that contribute to the work of psychiatry: nurses, doctors, social workers, psychologists, caseworkers, academic researchers, occupational therapists, policemen. While it is most assuredly it is not focal, for the work involved is typically contractual and largely of a different order, naturally I include as well the branch of psychiatry known as psychoanalysis. And I'll have more to say about that in the future. Like I said, Szasz has a book called The Myth of Psychoanalysis, which is a great book. But only peripherally, that is, only to the extent that is part of, buys into, depends on, or contributes to the work of the larger institution. The question is, how are we to understand this institution? How does it work? What is its genus, its nature? So here we have Burstow just asking great questions, and the answers that she gives are just excellent. So she does start off by reminding us of the falsity of the chemical imbalance hypothesis. Quote, as Whitaker and Colbert demonstrate, there is no evidence that the adults labeled mentally ill have a chemical imbalance. As with children, adults are placed on drugs on the basis of a presumed chemical imbalance for which there is no indicator, despite decades of looking for one. Correspondingly, research shows that even those seen as psychotic before being on the drugs would have fared better had they never taken them. And that's true. But unfortunately, because psychiatry exists and because people have such implicit faith in medicine, many people are learning the hard way what these drugs can do. So Burstow is very familiar with Szasz, and I think has read him quite thoroughly, understands him better than most people. So she has a little passage here. The point is, as Szasz and others have repeatedly pointed out, the very concept of mental illness is untenable, for illness by definition pertains to the body. The mind is simply an activity of the body. As such, well, I don't know about that, but as such it can be, there obviously is a very complicated question, but the question of the mind versus the brain, and the mind and the brain and the body and the whole human person, there are a lot of ideas to be discussed behind that. But Burstow is basically agreeing with Szasz that mental illness is a myth. Indeed, the fact that it is metaphoric is even acknowledged by the early psychiatric pioneers. This is a good point. So even the people who founded psychiatry acknowledge the fact that mental illness is a myth, but that acknowledgement kind of got lost in the literature. So note in this regard Kraepelin, who stated, 1901, 1968, who stated in his lectures, quote, "It is true in the strictest sense we cannot speak of the mind as being diseased," or von Fürchterleben, who clearly identified the use of medical language as a form of analogy, writing, quote, "The maladies of the spirit can be called diseases of the mind only per analogiam, or by analogy." Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong with using metaphors or analogies. We use them all the time. We refer to sick jokes, to the economy as sick. However, we do not bring in a doctor to cure the sick joke or attend to the ailing economy. Bonnie has a very good wry sense of humor. She continues, "Of course, the brain is an organ of the body. Brains do have illnesses. Accordingly, for centuries now, biological psychiatrists have argued that mental illnesses are brain diseases whose physical chemical markers are simply yet to be discovered," which is bogus. This, notwithstanding, what is generally considered the psychiatric Bible, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, does not claim that the diagnoses in question are brain diseases, only that it hopes that the biological basis of the various mental illnesses will be found. So, and as I've said before, they'll find a leprechaun or the Easter bunny before they find one of these biological markers. The framers put it in this somewhat duplicitous way because after over a century of looking, and indeed after dedicating vast sums of money to such research, moreover with bald-faced assertions ever circulating, including from official sources, that schizophrenia, for example, has been discovered to be a brain disease, there is no proof whatsoever that a brain disease or any other disease underlies any of the current so-called mental illnesses. The fact that this is an institution that operates on conjecture and declaration rather than proof, an institution that not just occasionally but routinely calls things diseases in the absence of the observable physical markers, I would add, raises the question whether we are truly dealing with medicine here, at least in the modern sense of the term. Indeed, it raises the question of whether we are dealing with science at all. And Burstow is absolutely correct. Psychiatry has nothing to do with science. It has nothing to do with medicine. It is pseudoscience, pseudomedicine, masquerading as a medical profession. To be clear, no one here is denying. Okay, and this is an important point that I need to reiterate throughout these videos. No one here is denying that people may be highly distraught, that people become confused, that people sometimes are in dire need of help. Nor is anyone denying that some people may have been helped by a psychiatrist, just as some people may have been helped by counselors, priests, homeopaths, or teachers. What is at issue is the medical model and the institution constructed in its name. So this is kind of like Whitaker's argument that psychiatry is a rotten barrel, but there's good people who are working in it. And mostly I concur with that. And obviously I agree that, as Bonnie says, people can be distraught for any wide variety of reasons. But that no more legitimizes psychiatry than anything else that's a natural phenomenon in this fallen world in which we live. Let's see. Bonnie is a deep thinker as well. She actually engages with Foucault, who has written extensively on madness and civilization. And to her credit, she actually she disagrees with Foucault about a lot of things. There are things that she thinks that he got right, but she dismisses those things that are relativistic in his thinking. So this would be maybe for more philosophical discussion later on, that the questions that Foucault raised and how Burstow responds to those is really good. Basically, she says that Foucault implicitly assumes a less relativistic stance toward truth than his theory propounds. So yeah, so Bonnie is actually trying to get at the truth and realizes you can't. There is truth to be found, and you can't get around that. And moral relativism that Foucault seemed to champion in some ways was not the answer. Let's see. This is a passage about the abolition of psychiatry. She says, I argue that not only must psychiatry be dismantled, but that the problems individualized by psychiatry run deeper than what can be solved by eliminating the institution, necessary though that is. So that's a very important point. Psychiatry itself needs to be abolished, but that's not enough. There are ideas, ideologies that run deeper that have to be exposed for what they are. The book culminates in a preliminary but meaty discussion of the more sweeping societal changes called for. So that's the part of her book that I disagree with. Even though she's right that there are deep underlying ideological currents that need to be dealt with in addition to abolishing psychiatry, she proposes what her replacement model of society would be, and I think it's a little bit of wishful thinking, but at least she's right that not only must psychiatry be abolished, but the myth of mental illness, along with the attendant chemical imbalance hoax and every other fraudulent activity in psychiatry, needs to be exposed for what it is, so not only the institution disappears, but people can replace, the falsities, absurdities of psychiatry with reason and sound judgment. So that's a little bit of an introduction there. This book contains an excellent history of psychiatry from ancient times to modern times, the evolution of psychiatry, starting with Hippocrates to the present. And it's so good, and there's so many great passages that I just suggest that you read it. She even goes through medieval Renaissance time, the witches, and Thomas Szasz wrote a lot about how psychiatry is similar to like the witch hunts and witchcraft. Which, interestingly enough, there's actually some evidence of that in the Bible as well. There's mention of several passages in the Bible that talk about, that use the word pharmakos or pharmakia. I'd have to look up which passage they are. I think there's one in Revelation. I think there's others in the Old or New Testament. That basically the entire world has been deceived by the pharmakeia, or the witchcraft, that is part of the unfolding of the apocalypse. Or I guess that's a redundant, because apocalypse means like opening up or revelation. So part of the revelation of the last day will be this pharmakeia, this witchcraft that has deceived the whole world. And obviously pharmakeia is related to the word pharmacy, pharmacon, pharmaceutical. So evidently there's something going on there about pharmaceutical companies, psychiatry, that we might even visit in a later video. But back to Burstow, she recounts the history of modern psychiatry as well. This is a good passage. Quote, more hospitals and clinics sprang up, and optimism gradually set in that medicine could solve all social problems. An optimism that was extended to the mad doctors, and despite the fact that mad doctoring was in no way connected with the scientific advances. So she just gives such a great, detailed evolution of psychiatry. Let me just pick out some important figures. The Quakers, Pinnell, William Tuke, King George III, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of the founding fathers, and a lot of others that were influential in the development of psychiatry. So yes, it's a great history. Here's a summary of that history. Quote, "We began this chapter with Shorter's depiction of," remember Edward Shorter, he wrote the apologetic work that was supposed to be a history of psychiatry, but it was actually an apologetic for psychiatry. "We began this chapter with Shorter's depiction of the rise of psychiatry as a triumph of the liberatory, the humane, and the scientific. Bit by bit, we have demonstrated that this depiction is inaccurate on every count. What materialized was not humane but brutal. The psychiatric state which emerged did not spell liberation but confinement on an unprecedented scale. Finally, and this is fundamental, as we saw clearly, psychiatry consolidated its power and harnessed the newly acquitted credibility of medicine, not by being scientific, but by mimicking the outward trappings of science and medicine." So there we have the word mimicking again, similar to what we were talking about with Thomas Szasz, mimicry or that the counterfeit. So psychiatry is mimicking or counterfeiting actual science and medicine. And it's also mimicking or counterfeiting actual healing, the healing power of the higher power of God or of Christ for those who have faith. And this is not to dismiss science or medicine at all, because real science and real medicine are compatible with revelation. So that's not to dismiss real science and real medicine, it's to dismiss the counterfeit. Then she goes, chapter 3 is, she gets into modern psychiatry. And early in the chapter, she reveals the connection between Nazi medicine and psychiatry, which really the connections run very deep, including the problem of eugenics, euthanasia, what Hitler was trying to do. He had much help from the doctors and psychiatrists in his regime. Let's see if there's anything specifically. Here's a passage, quote, "That many of the doctors were convinced that what was happening was both benign and medical is clear. What contributed to this self-delusion was an eerie shift, supported by the state, steeped in fascist ideology, and who actually constituted the patient." So this is an excellent point about Nazism and psychiatry, how they're connected. Let me read another passage real quickly. Quote, "At the same time, the harrowing truth that is much of what is now accepted as standard psychiatric practice is a product of the eugenics era, with all of the telltale signs, the presupposition of hereditary mental illness, the widespread acceptance of schizophrenia, biological psychiatry more generally, rampant experimentation, ever more genetic research, the proliferation of psychological testing, including the IQ. There is little awareness of the flimsy and indeed treacherous ground on which such practices, conceptualizations, and indeed preoccupations rest. Nor, for that matter, is there any official acknowledgement of psychiatry's pivotal role in the Holocaust." So psychiatry was pivotal in the Holocaust, and the ideologies inherent in psychiatry, even though they're now perpetuated in the guise of medicine, there's still the same underlying problem. And as Burstow points out, even in Nazi Germany, there were very good people, or people who thought they were being helpful, who were actually furthering the cause of Hitler, which is a terrible thing. And I think I gotta find this, because Burstow, she quotes C.S. Lewis on this topic, and maybe it's in her other book, so let me look real quickly if it's in here. because there's a wonderful passage by C.S. Lewis that is so relevant to psychiatry that it needs to be read and repeated, as C.S. Lewis should be read and repeated often. Maybe it's in this book. I'm hoping I can find it quickly for you because it's such a great quote. I know I marked it somewhere. So it's got to be in this book that I'm looking at already. Come on, little C.S. Lewis. Where are you? I know you're in here somewhere. I know it's in here, and I know I marked it. This little C.S. Lewis quote. I hope I find it quickly. Where did that go? Darn it. Okay, I'm going to look for it, but I know it's in one of these. And it's just so spot on. But Bonnie Burstow is smart. She read C.S. Lewis and quoted him correctly. So, but yeah, history of psychiatry, modern psychiatry connected with the Nazis. Bregan understands that. Burstow criticizes the chemical imbalance myth. She shows how the medical model of psychiatry has been promoted by the White House, by people such as the Clintons, Gore, Bush. Hillary Clinton even said that the goal was to, quote, identify and get help to children who need it, whether or not they want it or are willing to accept it. So there's Hillary Clinton for you promoting psychiatry. But other presidents have done the same, and unfortunately Obama, and unfortunately Trump, although I'm not quite sure exactly to what extent our president is promoting psychiatry. I wouldn't be surprised if he is, because most people do, whether wittingly or unwittingly. So other chapters include chapters on the DSM. I wanted to get into the Book of Woe by Gary Greenberg. He discusses the DSM. Let's see, the truth about the DSM. And she has a chapter, The Beast in the Belly of the Beast, Opinion by Paper, chapter 5, where Burstow really delves deeply into the whole system of psychiatry, the mental health system, all the connections, and how this vast apparatus is connected with the state, and even legislation. So there's a lot to be abolished, and there's a lot of work to be done there. I really like her chapters on the drugs, because Bonnie Burstow describes in detail what the drugs do, the psychotropic drugs that are euphemistically called medications, and she shows how what terrible damage these drugs do. Let's see if there's a passage that is well, here's a good summary. Let's see. Quote, correspondingly, with reference to all of this, but particularly to the activation of documents, we trace precisely how psychiatry rules, how patients are controlled, how patients are processed. What we witness, indeed, is a vast system of control, with chemical control at the center, with chemical control in the community as a desired end, with hospital as backup, indeed with services themselves essentially consisting of chemicalization with add-ons. Finally, we saw clearly in detail how even aspects of the system purportedly designed to protect patients from psychiatric excesses, the Consent and Capacity Board, for example, are predicated on and overwhelmingly reinforce psychiatry. Various thoughts crowd in on me as I ponder the insidious nature of this system. I leave you with just two. The first is that we have designed an institution so relentless as to never let go. We have designed, to put it another way, a trap. This is evident in the drugs on which people become hooked, commonly for life, always requiring just that extra adjustment. It is evident in the linking of services. More fundamentally, it is evident in the very laws and legal frameworks, the inclusion of such phenomena as community treatment orders that can be renewed indefinitely, appeal processes designed to fail, indefinite incarceration itself, involuntary admissions criteria that uniquely single out the person who has even but once accepted or been subjected to a treatment. My second reflection concerns the helpers themselves and the work which they invest to keep the whole operation running. While, as demonstrated previously, the converging interests of psychiatry and the pharmaceuticals, together with the prioritizing of those interests, is an overriding factor in what is transpiring, and we forget that to our peril. What is most obvious in the chapter, also perhaps most distressing, the business of madness, is substantially accomplished by everyday people diligently doing their jobs. By the emergency nurse ticking the appropriate box, the psychiatrist filling out the form, the police picking up the alleged disturber of the peace, the tribunal member weighing the evidence, the assertive action team scrupulously turning up at the apartment of the person who has missed their appointment. Harsh though this reference is, and to be clear, I intend it more as a heuristic than a judgment, I am reminded here of Hannah Arendt's insightful phrase, the banality of evil, an explanation in itself. The question nonetheless arises, but how can this be? How is it, say, that individual mental health workers, a large percentage of whom chose their avocation at least partially, presumably out of a heartfelt impulse to help, many of whom additionally are deeply concerned with ethical issues, continue to cooperate, be actors in, and perpetuate a system such as this? It's a brilliant insight, because just like in Nazi Germany with all the helpers that Hitler had who didn't know that they were helping with, they didn't necessarily know, not all of them, and there's more that I need to learn about this Hannah Arendt, because she was an interesting, insightful person. But what she's saying, what Burstow is saying is, all these good people who go into these professions because they want to help people, they've also been duped. Not just the so-called patients, but the workers. So the next chapter is a whole chapter on the psychiatric team, how all of that works, how it's all connected, why these people end up doing the work that they do, and what it actually produces. Chapter 7 is on the what she calls Pharmageddon, Pharmacy Unmasked, and this is a great chapter. Let's read a little bit about the drugs, because Burstow writes so clearly on this topic that I think, even more than Whitaker and Bregan, although both of them are excellent on this, on what the drugs are, what they do. This little passage here I think is helpful. Okay, quote, "So what do these drugs actually do? Before we tread further, I would introduce two considerations and ask the reader to bear them in mind. The first is how complex and interrelated the brain and its parts are. A galaxy in its own right. It contains, to quote Whitaker, 100 billion neurons, 150 trillion synapses, hundreds of neurotransmitters, and a multitude of interacting systems. This being the case, all positions vested in the drug have a simple effect or impacting a single system constitute a gross simplification. The second consideration is that given that these substances alter brain chemistry, and given that people being treated for mental illnesses in point of fact have normal brain chemistry, it stands to reason that these substances themselves create imbalances. Herein is our entry point to wit. The secret to understanding the actions of the drugs is to get to the bottom of the imbalances created in the brain's response. As the neuroleptics are allegedly schizophrenia specific, and as schizophrenia is the one condition that the public at large feels confident as a bona fide disorder, neuroleptics are the obvious starting point. So she starts with neuroleptics because as Szasz has written in another book, schizophrenia is the sacred symbol of psychiatry. If the base ideology underlying all of psychiatry is the myth of mental illness, schizophrenia is the sacred symbol of psychiatry as the um, most widely accepted um, bona fide disorder. And besides Szasz there and Bonnie Burstow, and how few people have stopped to really question, what the heck is schizophrenia? Is that really a thing? And Szasz, in his book, the Schizophrenia, the Sacred Symbol of Psychiatry, he shows that just as with hysteria and other so-called mental illnesses, schizophrenia is a myth. It's now this is going to sound very problematic to people who have known others who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. But and it's not to say, once again, it's not to say that people don't suffer with a wide variety of terrifying, even horrible symptoms. But it's just to say that the invention of schizophrenia, if people understood the history of it, how it was created, how it was invented, and that goes for autism as well. We'll talk about schizophrenia and autism in a future video. But the basic concept here is that mental illness is the myth upon which psychiatry is based, and schizophrenia is one of the main cogs in the wheel of mental illness. And then neuroleptics, or these early drugs, Haldol, Mellaril, Thorazine, and even Abilify, Risperdal, Zyprexa, these drugs are based on all these prior myths, and the actual results of these drugs are, as Burstow writes, they create horrifying problems, many of which are then subsequently diagnosed or labeled as mental illness. So what does Burstow say about this? Quote, "On a simple level, a normal brain has been transformed into an abnormal structure and a chemistry which is permanently out of balance. This permanent imbalance significantly, more than anything else, accounts for the revolving door syndrome, the persistent drug-level tinkering of putative relapses. Another inevitable consequence is brain shrinkage. Additional common, albeit not uniform, complications include akathisia, an agonizing restlessness, an inability to live in one's own skin, tardive psychosis, which befalls 30% of those on neuroleptics for a sustained period, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, a crisis which can lead to death, and tardive dyskinesia. The last is a severe and disfiguring neurological disorder, generally irreversible, and which, according to the APA's own figures, will afflict 15% of patients in the first 3 years exposure to a neuroleptic, with the risk rising with each additional year of exposure, quickly hitting the 40 to 50% level. Ironically, what is used to treat tardive dyskinesia is the causal agent or neuroleptic itself, for it serves to mask the problem. In this manner, users are propelled into a potentially endless downward spiral." And then here she references Bregan, because Bregan, we talked about in an earlier video about intoxication anosognosia, or medication spellbinding. So basically what's happening is a drug, a neuroleptic, is introduced to a person who is actually otherwise healthy, regardless of whatever problems or symptoms may be manifesting. Introducing this drug, which then creates havoc in the brain, which then manifests itself as what people consider to be a mental illness, after which more of the drug or other drugs are administered, which have the effect of sedating and producing what Bregan calls the medication spellbinding. Burstow continues, "Withdrawal from neuroleptics is difficult because the drugs mask the damage. A more pressing, albeit related factor is the persistence of compensatory actions. What is significant here, the compensatory actions do not stop immediately upon discontinuing the drug. To use Whitaker's metaphor of a car, it is as if the accelerator pedal has been floored and had stuck there. The point is that the brain continues to compensate for a hypothetical reduction of dopamine, albeit the reduction in question has ceased. The result? Especially where cold turkeying is the withdrawal method, the person is virtually flooded with dopamine, a formula for a psychosis. Predictably, correspondingly, what ensues tend to be interpreted by everyone, the doctor, loved ones, oftentimes the patient, as a return of the illness, correspondingly as proof of a pre-existing disorder for which the medication is needed generally for life. So you see this perpetuating cycle of the drug producing the symptom, which is supposed to be mental illness, which is then drugged further and, putting the brain into a constant, as if you're keeping your foot on the gas while also having the foot on the brake, is a metaphor that Whitaker uses. So lots of good stuff on how what the drugs do. And that's also a good reminder that you should never withdraw rapidly or cold turkey from psychotropic drugs. If you ever decide to do so, you should always do so very gradually, tapering slowly off the drug, because the brain is building up, it's fighting back against the effects of the drug, and if it's kind of like, the way I describe it is if you were to shake up a bottle of soda and then to quickly pull off the cap, it's going to fly everywhere. It's kind of what you're doing when you're injecting these chemicals into the human brain and then going off of them cold turkey. The tapering method is more like slowly opening the cap, letting a little bit of the pressure out. And none of this is easy, and in fact is very horrifically painful. People have described it as basically going through hell. And a lot of those people happen to be dead now because they've decided to end their lives rather than going through the hell of psychotropic drug withdrawal. I don't blame them for that, and I think they're actually martyrs in the cause against psychiatry. Also, I wouldn't even call that suicide when a person in that much pain decides to take their life. It's honestly, I would say that it's more murder on the side of the pharmaceutical industry that has produced these drugs that are known to cause suicide and other, horrible problems such as akathisia, the tremors and weight gain and they're called side effects, but I don't like the word side effects because a side effect implies that there's some good effect that the drug has when that's simply not true. So all of these terrible things that the drugs are doing, that's on the hands of psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry. Burstow reiterates Peter Bregan's concept of the medication spellbinding we discussed in a previous video. She also shows how a lot of these drugs have led to many of these shootings. I just heard about another shooting in Canada, terrible, Nova Scotia, many people killed. Whenever one of these shootings comes on the news, my first reaction is always to wonder, and sometimes I even go ask Ann Blake Tracy on her Facebook page, were psychotropic drugs involved? And more than 50% of the time, there was some connection to psychiatry and psychotropic drugs. So psychiatry and pharmaceutical industry have that blood on their hands as well. Um, but the question that sometimes arises is, well, what do you mean? These drugs help me. I got better. Like, look, I'm better now. And that's understandable. I like how Burstow explains this. Quote, so why do some folk feel better on these blatantly toxic substances? How is it they strike themselves or others as faring better? In part, as Moncrief, and this is another author we need to discuss, documents, SSRIs have an antihistamine and as such sedative properties. Additionally, an appreciable part of what is experienced as benign relates specifically to the activation. Activation gets people moving, as does the culminating disorder akathisia. On the face of it, a person who is moving may seem like they are doing better than a depressed person who can't drag themselves out of bed. Moreover, given the overall activation of the brain, the SSRIs, as noted, create euphoria. Euphoria feels better than severe depression, albeit it is actually a manifestation of brain dysfunction. That same dysfunction, correspondingly, accounts for the tragic unawareness of full-blown SSRI-induced mania. Bregen's concept of intoxication anosognosia is useful here. The point is the SSRIs themselves render people unaware of the impairment. So all the people being drugged and having their brains disabled are also at the same time believing that they're getting better. Moreover, insofar as their actions are problematic, and not everyone on these substances it renders them oblivious to this fact. In this regard, a brain flooded with serotonin is rather like a brain drenched in alcohol. Both can result in a good feeling. Correspondingly, both can result in impaired judgment, aggression, impulsivity, moreover, an awareness so impoverished that the person has little appreciation of their own state, of the dubious quality of their actions. Hence the temporary flare-ups so common in patients on SSRIs. On the extreme end, hence the rampant violence spree is documented in books like Medication Madness that we talked about earlier. All people who feel driven, people who perceive themselves as on a mission. So that's a little bit about the drugs. So much more. There's some personal stories. There's a whole chapter on electroshock. Bonnie Burstow is one of the world's leading experts on electroshock and what that is and why it's problematic. So, and then as I mentioned, the last chapter is Burstow's attempt to come up with an alternative for once psychiatry has been abolished and these false concepts have been eliminated. She wants to replace it with something else, which I think is a little bit wishful thinking and actually not constructive to what she's trying to accomplish. So that's Psychiatry and the Business of Madness. Highly recommend it. I still want to find the C.S. Lewis quote because it could be like for psychiatric survivors or for a anti-psychiatrist or even for people who are critical of psychiatry. It could be a mantra. It bears repeating. I might have included it on my website, and that's why I'm not finding it immediately in the book. Or maybe she quoted it elsewhere, and I'm just remembering it. But I could have sworn it's in one of these chapters. Shoot. I know it's in here. Well, that's Thomas Szasz, Bonnie Burstow. Maybe it's on my blog. That's probably where I posted it. Well, I know that I have before. Let's see. If you read my blog, you'll basically know more than anyone in the world about psychiatry. So, Burstow, her books, abolition. I did say that I was going to talk about the Book of Woe. This is um, Gary Greenberg's book on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So I'm going to talk briefly about that. And I'm just going to look up this C.S. Lewis quote because it's easy to find on the internet, and I know Bonnie Burstow quotes it, but here it is. And it's in his book, God in the Dock, Essays on Theology. Quote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will, and cured of states which we may not regard as disease, is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classified with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals." That's a perfect description of psychiatry. It is a tyranny that is often sincerely exercised for the good of its victims. So what's it's even worse than, well, in some ways it's worse than in some ways it's been called a more feminine tyranny, like the masculine tyranny being that of like a Hitler or a Stalin or one of these tyrants that's just a boot on your face, 1984, we're going to stamp out your freedom, as opposed to what has been called a feminine tyranny of kind of the we're gonna take care of you even though you don't want to be taken care of. Now, that's, C.S. Lewis wasn't necessarily talking about psychiatry there, but you can see evidence of that kind of tyranny all around us. I mean, even in this current pandemic, if you think about it, there's a lot of this, I've seen on the internet people being called Karens, the female name, Karen, a Karen as being one of these omnipotent moral busybodies, one of these people running around saying, stay in your house, wash your hands, It's like, okay, we get it, there's a pandemic, we're gonna be careful, but and these are people who are doing so out of the goodness of their own heart because they want to, they see themselves as doing good, but they're what C.S. Lewis called omnipotent moral busybodies. So that was the quote I was looking for. So to wrap up this session, I would like to talk about Gary Greenberg's book, The Book of Woe. I don't have a copy of the book with me, but I've read it, and here's the blog post. If I can show it. No, this isn't going to work. I'll have to figure out a way to do this, but basically it's the blog is called The Book of Woe, blog post. And maybe you've taken a moment to hit pause and get refreshed and come back. I'm just going to keep going because I could talk about this forever. So the Book of Woe. Have you ever wondered where... So this is to build off of everything we've talked about thus far and talk about what Bonnie Burstow calls the... what does she call it? Anyway, the text that's at the core of all these problems is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So now we're going to dissect where this came from and why it's a problem. Have you ever wondered where terms such as ADD, ADHD, MDD, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia come from? Wonder no longer. In the Book of Woe, the DSM and the Unmasking Psychiatry, author and practicing psychotherapist Gary Greenberg pulls back the curtain on the not-so-wonderful Wizard of Woe. With wry humor and whimsical rhetorical flair, Greenberg describes the process by which a group of the world's top psychiatrists join forces to create a work of fiction so captivating that it has the potential to redefine reality. Greenberg's scathing commentary on the construction of the DSM V, the fifth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, penetrates to the rotten core of psychiatry while simultaneously excavating priceless philosophical pearls from the oyster shells of ontology. Wow, I was kind of waxing poetic there, but basically Gary Greenberg is showing where the DSM V comes from and why we should be concerned. Greenberg begins his book with a reference to one of history's most decadent diagnoses. In 1850, the New Orleans physician Samuel Cartwright observed that many African slaves seemed to be suffering from what he considered to be a new disease. Drapetomania, as Cartwright called it, was the disease causing Negroes to run away. Greenberg trenchantly reports that drapetomania was never considered for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the American Psychiatric Association's Compendium of Mental Illnesses, but that may be only because there was no such book in 1850. So that's the origin of the so-called diagnosis of drapetomania that we talked about earlier. Even though drapetomania never became part of the psychiatric compendium until 1973, the DSM listed homosexuality as a mental illness. We mentioned this in previous videos. In the Book of Woe, Greenberg traces some of the changes that have taken place since the debut of the DSM, while providing a rare glimpse into the construction of the most recent edition of the Bible of Psychiatry, the DSM V. As Greenberg was well aware, during the construction process there was no foundation to the mythical illnesses that made up this edifice of psychiatry. Greenberg was close enough to the construction site, and his prose is engaging enough that I need only furnish a few choice excerpts from the final chapter in order to pique curiosity. When asked by a colleague, quote, "Why do you hate psychiatrists so much?" and when he was accused of bias, Greenberg simply replied, "It isn't bias to be skeptical, and it's not anti-psychiatry to question psychiatry, and it's not silly in the context of a book about diagnoses to ask how nosology, a branch of medicine that deals with the classification of diseases, relates to the practice of psychiatry." Greenberg continues, "I gave Francis," and Francis is one of the people who worked on the book, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, "I gave Francis a hypothetical case, a psychotic person he is diagnosed with bipolar disorder. How does that diagnosis help him to proceed?" I asked. It was a question former APA President Paul Fink once answered by saying, "I got paid." Francis replied to the same question and was evasive. "Like to help, but the question makes no sense to me. Suggest you read the textbooks of psychiatry." So here's Greenberg asking the right questions, and one of the respondents, this guy Paul Fink, just says clearly, why'd he do it? Because he got paid for it. He got money. And then Francis just avoids the question. Greenberg goes on to explain, quote, "You don't have to hate psychiatrists to point out that their expertise is mostly empirical and their treatments potentiated at least as much by hope as by chemistry. Or to put it another way, that psychiatry, much more than other medical specialties, is still deeply in the debt of ancient medicine." So I don't agree with this part, but I'm trying to find where he talks about the ever-expanding DSM. Okay, so he says, "You don't have to hate psychiatrists to think that a book that dresses up symptoms as diseases that are not real and then claims to have named and described two varieties of suffering is all clothes and no emperor. And you don't have to hate psychiatrists to think we, patients, doctors, therapists, all of us might be better off without it." So I like Greenberg's bluntness there and just to the point. Really, this is not about hating psychiatrists. It's not about even hating psychiatry. It's about pointing out the reality, the truth about it, that it's by showing the rotten barrel so maybe the good apples can get out. So the metaphor of the emperor without clothes is repeated often in the anti-psychiatry literature, and it's a good one. Because really, that's what psychiatry is. It's the naked emperor walking around and everyone praising him, and it just takes one innocent and pure boy who sees the truth and just says, look, the dude's naked. So that's what Greenberg is doing. That's what Burstow is doing. That's what Szasz and Whitaker and Bregan and many others have been doing. So let's see. Let's see if there's anything else from this. The Book of Woe, he basically shows the history of the DSM, how this group of psychiatrists and other people got together, the financial motive behind it, how they created these supposed categories of disease, and how they profited from marketing these fake diseases. It's an amazing book because if everyone read that book and understood how the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual was created, no one would ever go to a psychiatrist. No one would ever accept one of these fake diagnoses, or they're not really diagnoses because they're labels. And, no one would touch psychiatry with a 10-foot pole. Let's see. So I will mention that the DSM V has almost 1,000 pages in it, and it costs, at least at the time that I wrote this, it costs $100. So millions, the people who created this made millions and millions of dollars off of this supposed Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but every single piece of it is fictional. Like there's no real measurable disease in the whole entire book. It's all made up, and now everything, all these labels have been distributed to all these people who think they're mentally ill because they've been given a label of bipolar or ADD or ADHD or schizophrenia or any number of fake diseases. But since there's this DSM-5, it's the Bible of psychiatry, a lot of people have been duped by it. So that is enough about the Book of Woe. I highly recommend you read Gary Greenberg's book, The Book of Woe. So that should suffice for today. And we've talked about Burstow, we've talked about Thomas Szasz, Gary Greenberg, and what is psychiatry, what is antipsychiatry, and in future videos, I hope to delve a little more deeply into more specific topics, but there's a lot more to talk about with Thomas Szasz, and there's a lot more to talk about with the Mad in America website, and what is currently happening in psychiatry and the anti-psychiatry movement. So I hope this has helped to bring a little clarity on the truth about psychiatry, and I will be back soon.